A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Kicking in on this week's political agenda with the Australian Christian Lobby, and Wendy Francis is back with us today, the National Director of Politics for the ACL, joining us. Wendy's also a player in the significant role that she has on the Vision Board, always a great guest. And if you are looking for an update on the state of where things are at in Australia today, get ready for a quick fire update on the state of the nation grappling with ethics and policy and where Christians sit in the mix. We're 90 minutes away from talking with one of our nation's mega church leaders. Pastor Dale Stevenson will be sharing his thoughts on building discipleship culture in your local church. He leads Crossway Baptist Church in Melbourne. It's the biggest Baptist church in the nation. Get ready for that conversation in around 90 minutes from now. Then on Faith and the Future with Dr. Camille Majdali, our series is on the Anzac legacy. Today we're unpacking some of the background to Gallipoli. We're back for a big year ahead in 2024, engaging conversations ahead on this Monday edition of 2020. As we do on a Monday, and as we will do throughout the year, we'll be checking in with the Australian Christian Lobby at this time as we get thinking about the ethics and about the theology and about where Christians sit on a whole range of developments that are happening in our nation of Australia. Wendy Francis, National Director of Politics for the ACL, back with us. Hey Wendy, welcome back to 2020.
So good to be back, Neil. And boy, we do have a lot of things to get through this morning, don't we? Because we've hit the ground running, that's for sure.
Okay, well, Wendy, let's start with something that we've been talking about really for over a year now. This thought of a religious discrimination bill, and the Australian Law Reform Commission has been considering what they're going to be able to do with Christian schools. Where do we start with this one?
So the ALRC, the Australian Law Reform Commission, they have given their report, their recommendations to the government, but they have not been made public yet. Now, this government has said that they will not bring in a religious discrimination bill until they get that report from the ALRC on the Sex Discrimination Act. So we are waiting on both of those things. This actually predates the religious discrimination bill, goes right back to 2017 when same-sex marriage came in, and the government said then we are going to need to bring in a religious discrimination bill because schools and churches are going to need to be protected to be able to continue to believe what they actually believe through their faith. So we're still waiting. We do expect that early in this year. Our CEO, Michelle Pearce, she has been invited to come and speak with the AG, the Attorney General, next week. So we do expect to get some information from that meeting. But certainly the need to protect religious freedom in order to allow churches and faith-based schools to continue operating according to their beliefs is just so important. So yeah, we're still working on that.
Freedom of thought, freedom of conscience. Those are the foundations, aren't they? And if you want any freedom at all, you have to have freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, and those are the things that are under threat with that particular deliberation from the Australian Law Reform Commission, and I know that there's ways that listeners can take some action there. Let me ask you about the issues around deductible gift recipients. Wendy, there's lots to cover. This DGR rebate, some radical changes are being debated right now. Give us your insights.
So a lot of your church pastors, people who are listening, your church pastors, your schools, they will be aware of what's happening. And this is part of what we're looking at with the government squeezing faith-based organisations all the time. So despite the evidence that is indisputable, actually, that demonstrates that people of faith give more to charity, they volunteer more time than their secular counterparts do, and there's obviously also a very positive correlation between faith and philanthropy. The government is proposing, despite all of that, they're proposing really radical changes to their rules on tax incentives. So they're wanting to remove, they want to exclude advancing religion from this DGR status. They want to exclude school building funds. Now, of course, governments already provide the capital funding for students in government schools because that's what the government does for their own state schools. But there's only a fraction of the capital needs for students in faith-based schools that is actually helped by the government. So they rely on this DGR status. They're also wanting to remove the DGR status for religious education in government schools. And so we are in deep talks with the government at the moment, but also along with the Christian schools, pastors and leaders of other Christian charities as well.
Wendy, if you're thinking through the issue here and the government's deliberation around DGR, is it really even wise to think, or is it jumping to conclusions to think that somehow or other churches appear to be a target here? Because this actually does really bring this into focus, doesn't it? That schools are an extension of the work of the local church, and schools being the foot in the door and churches now under attack around this DGR. Is it, are we being paranoid to think that churches here are under a special focus, a special target from our government?
I don't think we're being paranoid at all. I mean, there's no doubt we still have an amazing sense of freedom here in Australia, and we need to be very grateful for that. We're not at a position where we are under physical attack, but we are definitely being squeezed as to whether we have the right to actually speak and teach what we believe from the Bible. Now, when I say that we are under attack and we have rights, we are not actually fighting for our own rights. Neil, you and I are old enough to understand that we are not worried about our own rights, but we are concerned for our children. We are concerned for our grandchildren, that they will retain the right to have freedom of religion and freedom of conscience, as you say, but also the freedom that comes with freedom of faith, freedom of conscience, freedom of thought is a benefit to our entire country. So we're not talking about something that is just a welfare for Christians. We are talking about something that is for the welfare of our entire nation. And so it is worth fighting for, and definitely it's not paranoid to think the churches are being targeted.
So, as we would all appreciate, that our Christian faith passes from generation to generation. That's how it's been for the past 2,000 years. And so in Australia, we've had this wonderful Christian foundation. There's been an enabling of our faith to pass from generation to generation through our school system, through our churches, and that deductible gift recipient has made that a real possibility. And now that is at risk. There's more to say on that, and no doubt we'll be enlarging on that as we continue through this year, Wendy Francis. I've got so much to cover with you. Let's move on. Concerns over the rise in anti-Semitism in Australia. What have you been feeling, and what sort of discussions have been happening at the Australian Christian Lobby?
So I think we've all seen the disgusting examples of anti-Semitism. We've seen shouting like "Gas the Jews." We've seen people carrying Jewish flags being arrested and taken off the street. We've seen shops even graffitied. So this is shocking in our nation, absolutely shocking. And so ACL began a petition. It's ended up being quite a large petition. We're just calling on the government to really stamp down on this anti-Semitism, to use the anti-vilification laws that are already in place to stop this happening. We've got over 11,000 signatures on that petition, and it closes at the end of this week because we want to present it next week in the first week of sitting in Parliament. So we encourage people to sign that. I guess one of my main concerns about this, Neil, though, is that the latest ruling in the International Court of Justice in The Hague that did not rule out Israel committing genocide. They did not rule that out. That is not going to help. That is only going to increase the public pressure on Jews, on Israel, even in our own nation. And whilst the International Court did not rule that the war was illegal and that it had to stop, it still is concerning because it has opened up another huge debate. And I believe that Israel will be under increasing political and public pressure to change its tactics. And so we're concerned that that will actually have a flow-on effect in anti-Semitism in Australia.
And so when we see a movement in the sentiments that go away from some level of standing in solidarity with Israel, being able to defend itself against those terror attacks from October 7, as we see the world pendulum swinging one way and another, that has major effects all around the world for how people will view the Jewish people. And so this rise in anti-Semitism, and of course we've had a number of issues, of course, that have been arising of recent times, where the Jewish people in Australia, the Jewish people have felt as though they are under threat. They ought not to feel like that, Wendy. Just a quick thought here: with rising anti-Semitism in Australia puts a people group under threat because they live in fear. Any thoughts from you there?
And who would have believed that that would happen in Australia for one people group? No people group should feel under threat. But we've had people who are of Jewish descent stuck in hotels with the lobby filled with hate-filled cries. We've had people who are, as I say, moved off the street, just ones and twos, when there's massive crowds shouting hateful things against them. This should not be happening in Australia. And the government has already the legislation there to shut this down. So it's hard to understand why it isn't shut down. But the concern for me is that the latest things that have happened in the International Court will only, the potential is for that to increase, not decrease. So we need to stand very strong. And we are not saying that we're taking any side in this even. I don't think you need to take a side to say, I certainly believe that Israel has the right to defend themselves, but you don't need to take a side to say that this should not be happening in our nation.
Let me ask you about one of the issues that people will sometimes raise when it's about the issue around Israel and Hamas, and that is around this issue of compassion. And of course, as Christian people, we are compassionate people, but innocent Palestinian victims of the conflict, Palestinian Christians even, who are within the bounds of Gaza. Have you had any thoughts there? Because as we want to make sense of it, we want to stand with Israel. We want to defend their right to be able to defend themselves. They want to take down Hamas so that the threat to their own people is removed. We're also brought into this concern around the compassion for what are innocent Palestinian people. Any thoughts here from you?
So the whole, I guess that when people say that there's a genocide happening, and this is what the South African government said to The Hague, there is no genocide happening from Israel towards the Palestinians, because what they are wanting to stamp out is Hamas, and they are making sure that aid gets through the Palestinians. But there is no doubt at all that innocent Palestinians are getting caught up in this conflict. And we know of that there's a group in Australia called the Palestinian Christians in Australia, and they have brought to our attention, and also through us to the government, to their attention, that there's about 200 Christians at the moment sheltering in church buildings in Gaza who have valid Australian visas, but they're currently not being allowed to come because we're not taking in anyone from Gaza. Now, these people are innocent victims. They have valid Australian visas, and we're calling on the government to act on their behalf, really, and praying that these people will get the necessary support to reach safety.
And for the Christian, standing in solidarity with the nation of Israel, because it seems to me, Wendy, that anything less actually fuels an anti-Semitism. That doesn't mean that you do away with your compassion for innocent Palestinians who may themselves be under threat, but there's certainly a standing in solidarity with the people of Israel. Lots more to talk about that, no doubt. Let's move on. As I said, there's a lot of things on a list of things to cover today, just getting an update. Gender ideology, this has been one we've been talking about for a long, long time now. What's the latest?
It's something that's really key for ACL. And interestingly, the World Health Organization is not normally a friend of ours, to be honest. It's not an organization that I often have a high regard for. But the latest advice from the WHO have come out and saying that there is not sufficient evidence to be able to safely recommend affirmation therapy for minors. Now, this is groundbreaking, really. But despite this, in Melbourne, in their Royal Children's Hospital, they continue to see patients, it's not patients, it's ridiculous because it's not an illness to be born in a male or a female body, but they continue to see children from 3 years old for gender dysphoria, and these children are consequently placed on a pathway to transition. This is diabolical. This is actually child abuse, and so the WHO coming out with this is something that we can really try and gather momentum on, particularly from our MPs, to call a halt to what's happening to our children from 3 years old, but also to finally agree to have an inquiry into what is best practice for children who are confused about their gender.
Okay, we might all be very concerned when we hear of children just 3 years old being treated for gender dysphoria, and that is continuing today, even as we speak, at Melbourne Royal Children's Hospital Gender Clinic. And as you say, the World Health Organization doesn't even affirm that, but that is happening in the state of Victoria at Melbourne Royal Children's Hospital. We'll be following that closely too. Let's talk about some of the state issues, and we might need to rattle through some of these because there's so many. Let's start with the state of Queensland. What's happening for Queensland this year?
So it's an election year, so it's big because it means in an election year, any time there's an election, we can bring in some really important issues and ask the different MPs and the different parties what their position is. So, I mean, at the moment, the Labor Party are pushing for abortion bills to be administered by nurses and midwives. That will be one of the things that we'll be asking our governments, which way are you going to go on this? We have a petition on that as well. It's currently around 3,000. We really want to get that up to 5,000, but our State Director, Rob Norman, is appearing at the inquiry about that.
acl.org.au for listeners looking for that petition, because a push for abortion pills to be administered by nurses and midwives in the state of Queensland and an election later in the year. Let's talk South Australia. What's on the agenda there, Wendy?
There's always some good things in South Australia. So at the moment, there is an inquiry into gender affirmation therapy, gender ideology, that's been tabled, and whether or not it will go forward will come up in early February. So we're really hoping that will be successful. It'll be the first state, if that's possible, to go through. There's a move also to introduce the Nordic style model of prostitution legislation. That would be amazing. It would be the first state in Australia if that actually got through. If it was successful, the sort of thing that legislation does is that it provides exit strategies particularly for women who are trapped in that modern form of slavery, really. And the Walk for Life is coming up soon, so keep an eye out for information on that if you're in South Australia, because thousands join in that. So some good things happening in South Australia.
And let's put the icing on the cake, and I know that Tassie listeners might be wondering what's going on in their state. What's the latest for Tasmania?
So sadly, their government is following in the path of Victoria along the whole conversion therapy legislation model and banning conversion therapy. Now, I think your listeners already understand that conversion therapy in this modern age is not talking about some torturous, cruel practice that, of course, none of us would actually agree to. They are already illegal. But modern conversion therapy is the government wanting to ban things like speaking truth to somebody about their biological sex, even praying for someone to understand who they truly are, parents talking to their children and stopping small children from transitioning. This is enabling school to transition children without their parents' knowledge even. So there is an inquiry happening there. Submissions are due mid-February, about 16th of February. And this week on Wednesday, we're actually holding a webinar. So Tasmanians, we've got a webinar to show you how easy it is to actually make a submission into this inquiry. So I'd love you to join that webinar.
I thought it was going to be the icing on the cake, but let's squeeze in an extra couple of issues because I don't want to miss The Northern Territory, they have an election coming up 24th of August. But let's jump to
important.
Victoria, because there's something very significant. Victoria considering the removal of the Lord's Prayer from Parliament. Just quickly on the latest there.
So this comes up every now and then in councils, and now at this time it's in the state parliament. The Lord's Prayer continues to have a legitimate place in Parliament. It's been part of the parliamentary process since 1918. It's symbolic not only of the Christian ethos that underpins Western civilization, but it's symbolic. It's a tradition for all Australians. And at the moment, we seem to be trying to get rid of all of our traditions that come back to our democratic system, our Westminster system, and removing this prayer from Parliament is actually part of an act of eliminating our history, because it's our Judeo-Christian history. So we are calling on the government to retain the Lord's Prayer in the Victorian Parliament. So you can join that as well.
Well, Wendy Francis, always outstanding insight. And for listeners, this time slot through the year 2024, we'll be continuing getting updates from the Australian Christian Lobby. And for so many, it's just the way, because really you're not hearing this anywhere else. Your opportunity to get an update on what is happening with the ethics and the politics. And Wendy Francis, you're always such a valued guest. There's a number of issues that listeners could follow through, whether it's a petition to sign or just finding more detail about the sorts of things we're talking about today in your state, or those things that are all about the whole nation. You can go to acl.org.au. That's the website for the Australian Christian Lobby, acl.org.au. Wendy Francis, thank you so much for another great update today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil. God bless you all.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.